and that is due their regular processes for making subgrants, which include attaching similar assurances as the ones that states agreed to in their grant award notification.
Thanks. Here's the second question. Does the May 24th allocation deadline apply only to the first pot of money, or the first tranche from the ESSER allocation from the department?
It does, and at the same time, the grant award notification also requires that SEAs inform LEAs of their total allocation under both the first set of funds that's already been released and the remaining funds that will be released.
Thanks. Here's another one. If the SGA has already developed and released an application and award process, and they're preparing to award the funds by May 24th, but the LEA application didn't include or contain all of the necessary components, must the SGA require the LEA to submit a second ESSER application?
Yes, it's absolutely fine if some of that information comes in earlier and some comes in later from the LEA to the SEA. We anticipate that districts will be providing some information in some cases sooner, and then some cases as they go about the planning that's required under the interim final requirements and in the outline in the state application, which includes critical provisions like stakeholder engagement.
So in that case, is the 90-day LEA deadline that's described on page 13 of the state plan document, is that referring to 90 days from the LEA receiving its first ESSER allocation, or 90 days from the state receiving its allocation?
So the deadline for LEAs to submit must be reasonable, as we described in the rule and in the application, and it should be within 90 days of the LEA getting its allocation, and the states will be determining that timeline, again, in accordance with those provisions.
And if a state had a deadline that was longer than 90 days for LEAs to submit their ESSER applications, are they now required to, is the state now required to shorten that timeline?
Yeah, so again, the same answer would apply, that the timeline must be reasonable. And one of the things that we would look to is, does the timeline reflect the necessary urgency that we know we share with states and districts about making sure that these resources are available to support students in schools.
Thanks, that's it for now.
That it is.
Next slide.
They have on my screen that my whatever player back ticket is not valid for this session.
Hey Jane, it's Michelle. You're on mute. Please unmute your device.
Thank you. So let me go back and say again, we know that everyone has access to the state application plan template, but we do want to spend some time walking through it and highlighting some of the goals that the department has in each of the sections. We want to talk a little bit about the kind of information we're hoping to receive and encourage states to provide in their application and why we think it's important. So the first section in A is progress and promising practices. So here we want to understand the progress that states have made over the last year in supporting students and educators in schools. We understand that states have done a lot, and we want to know what they believe has been most effective and that the rest of the nation can learn from. The second is the overall priorities. So building on the promising practices and the progress made, we want to know what you have identified as your priorities as we move forward. So what do you look to do for the remainder of this school year, as well as into the summer and next fall? And then finally, we want to understand the specific needs of underserved students. If you could go to the next slide, please.
They want to understand.
So the ARP ESSER application identifies individual student groups and wants the state to explain how they're going to be meeting the needs of these underserved students, how these students will be supported. So those include students from low-income families, students from each racial and ethnic group, gender, English learners, children with disabilities, students that are experiencing homelessness, children and youth in foster care, migratory students, and other groups that have disproportionately been impacted by the pandemic and that have been identified by the state education agency. So that might include youth that are involved in the criminal justice system, students who have missed the most in-person instruction during the previous school year, and students who did not consistently participate in remote instruction as buildings were closed, and then LGBTQ students as well. So throughout the application, when we refer to underserved students, we are referring to these student groups. Next slide, please. Finally, in section A, we also want to understand the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic has had on those students. And then also want to understand what the school operating status is. So I'm going to pause for just a second to emphasize the importance of transparency in operational status. As you know, the administration has put a high value on understanding the status of instructional modes, whether it is fully in person, hybrid, or fully remote. And now we want some more information about the operating status across local education agencies. And we also want to think about how that is consistent with some of the disparities that we're seeing in student groups, those that are participating in in-person instruction now, and asking more questions and doing some critical thinking about how that impacts priorities for moving forward. Next slide, please. Great, thank you. So section B of the application is focused on safely reopening schools and sustaining their safe operation. So first, it includes support for local educational agencies or LEAs and how the state education agency is supporting them in implementing, to the extent practical, prevention and mitigation policies that are aligned with the guidance from the CDC. Second, we're looking at the safe return to in-person instruction and continuity of service plans. So with this, we're thinking about how states are supporting local education agencies with meeting the requirements of the American Rescue Plan, how they're ensuring that local education agencies are posting the plans as required and described in the IFR and reviewing those plans. Next slide, please. In section C, we are looking at the planning for the use and coordination of American Rescue Plan ESSER funds. So the first area of emphasis here is on stakeholder engagement. Period. How they are engaging in the process, what we're learning from them, and how it is impacting our plan. Next slide, please. So specifically, we're expecting there to be broad public input into this plan, and that would include the stakeholders that are listed on this slide. Next slide, please. And then in the next section of Part C, this is about coordinating funds across pandemic-related funding sources, as well as other related funding streams. So one key question would be whether you have allocated and awarded your ESSER 1 and ESSER 2 money to school districts. Obviously, we believe that there is incredible urgency in making sure that those funds are allocated and available to the local education agencies and the students and families that are served by them. We want to better understand what states, where you are in that regard. And then finally, for some really good news, the SRSA Act, or the CRRSA Act, sometimes it's called, the SRSA Act required that ESSER II grantees submit a 6-month report. And in submission of this ARP ESSER plan, that is going to fulfill that 6-month reporting requirement under the SRSA Act. Next slide, please. And finally, to section B. This is focused on maximizing the state level funds to support students. So here we're asking about state set-asides, the ones that Ian mentioned earlier in the presentation. And those include that at least 5% is going to address the academic impact of lost instructional time, at least 1% to summer enrichment and comprehensive after-school programs would receive at least 1%. And in all of those, we are looking at the use of evidence-based intervention.
Data.
The other bucket around emergency needs, this is also from your state reserve, and we want to understand how you are planning to use those funds to build the state education agency and the local education agency capacity to make sure that students' health and safety needs are met, as well as their academic, social, and emotional needs. And through all of this, ensuring that the funds are used to implement evidence-based intervention.
Evidence-based intervention.
So with that, I'm going to turn to Meredith Miller, who's going to wrap up as the discussion of the template and then move into some next steps. So next slide, and here you go, Meredith.
Thanks, Jane. The department recognizes that the safe return to in-person instruction must be accompanied by a focus on meeting students' academic, social, emotional, and mental health needs, and by addressing the opportunity gaps that existed before and were exacerbated by the pandemic. In this section, section E, FBAs will describe how they will support their LEAs in developing high-quality plans for LEA's use of ARP funds to achieve these objectives. This includes LEA plans for how they will use ARP ESSER funds, LEA consultation, how the SBA will monitor LEA use of the funds, and how the SBA will support LEA implementation of strategies addressing educational equity. Next slide, please.
Educational equity, good.
The department recognizes the toll that COVID-19 pandemic has taken on the nation's educators as well as students. So this section, section F, SBAs will describe strategies for supporting and stabilizing their educator workforce and for making staffing decisions that would support students' academic, social, emotional, and mental health. Next slide.
Staffing decisions.
The department also recognizes that transparency on how our ESSER funds are used and their impact on the nation's education system is a fundamental responsibility of federal, state, and local government. So in this section, section G of the application, SBAs will describe how they're building capacity at the SBA and LEA levels to ensure high quality data collection and reporting and to safeguard funds for their intended purposes.
Yes.
Next slide.
Real training. This is a real
So
training.
that is a description very briefly of all the sections of the application. We wanted to give you an overview of our next steps and how we can support you through this process. So today was our first webinar on the state plan application template. I know many of you are putting questions in the chat, which we'll collect and hope to answer. And if we can't answer today, we will try to answer in the future. You can also send your questions to ESSERF@ed.gov, which is the website on that slide.
SRF.
We also plan on having ongoing
can barely
technical
see it.
assistance and ed office hours. So right now our plan is to have a weekly office hours session where we're not delivering new content, but but rather being there to answer your questions as they arise and as you're working through this process. One bit of information that's new, and we'll make sure to put in writing as well, is that on May 14th, we would request that you provide notification if you as an FTA will not meet the June 7th deadline due to state requirements that preclude submission by that date. So for example, maybe you have a pre-existing state board approval requirement. If you could provide that notification to us if you have to send that, please do so by May 14th to the SRS mailbox, and that will help us plan how many applications we'll have by the June 7th deadline. Please also note that the applications will be posted upon receipt. So I'm going to turn it back over to Britt and Ian to answer further questions.
Any
Thank
questions, y'all?
Thanks, Meredith. The next set of questions have to do with the details or the contents of the state plan.
This
So
is
the first question is regarding
a new MacBook Pro
the
with errors
information contained in
everywhere.
Table A1, identifying the needs of underserved students. The SBA must break out student needs by a number of different subgroups. What if the SBA believes the needs are the
Disaggregated data.
same for multiple subgroups?
Yeah, we believe this is a really critical provision, and I think a really helpful question. We would certainly expect that some of the strategies that states and districts will use will be consistent for different groups of students. At the same time, we believe it's essential that states and also LEAs use data from multiple sources to really think about how the pandemic has impacted different student groups differently. And so again, while some of the strategies may be the same, we also know that the experience during the pandemic of, for example, English learners has in some ways been notably different than the experience of students with disabilities in terms of the additional supports and services that they may need.
Thanks. And the IFR requires SBAs to post information on their websites on the school's mode of instruction and student enrollment data by subgroups. So we have a few questions related to that provision. If the SBA doesn't have some of the data related to school mode of instruction and student enrollment data by the subgroup, must it start collecting the data, or is there an obligation to report whatever data the SBA has?
We know that states have already been building, and in many cases already having transparency for data systems that get at the modality of learning across their LEAs. If a state is not in a position to have that data, we definitely want to understand that state's situation and understand the protocols that they're putting in place. And so we'd urge them to contact the department. Appendix, I believe, A of the state plan application template includes how the information on modality by school and enrollment by modality by student group should be made available. And again, we think that that data is really critical to understanding the current circumstances in a state and the needs of the state.
And related, what if the school districts don't disaggregate these data by the student subgroup?
Yeah, so again, I think we'd want to really understand the situation in that particular state or LEA, including what data they do have, and so we'd urge them to contact the department directly.
Contact the Department of Education.
And what if schools are done for the school year? What data should be reported?
In that case, a state should use the most recent data available. So for example, that may be from the prior.
And what should be reported when there's a parent or family choice between virtual and in-person? For example, fully in-person or hybrid was extended as an option, but the families chose to keep their students in remote instruction.
That's right. So in that case, we were specifically asking about enrollment. So it would be the modality in which the student is participating, not what was offered by a school or school district.
Switching now to this review of...
And I'm sorry, I would just flag on that just to provide a little bit of context, one of the reasons why that's so important is in the data that the National Center for Education Statistics has been reporting from a sampling of schools. We're seeing really significant disparities as recently as data from February in enrollment in in-person instruction versus fully remote instruction. by race ethnicity, as well as for English learners and students from low-income families. And we think it's important for to have transparency about that data and for states to be using that data as they think about their strategy moving forward.
Thank you. Switching now to talk about the department's process, can you say a little bit about what the department's process will be for reviewing and approving state plans?
Sure. So the department is planning to have a process that is expeditious and that is also meaningful. We want to be able to, as soon as the plans come in, initiate a review, ask any questions of states that are necessary, and then provide a response. And of course, the approval of the state plan is what then triggers the release of the remaining 1/3 of each state's allocation. I would note that there will not be peer review of the applications that are submitted. They will be reviewed by department staff.
Great, thanks. So now we'll move to the questions in the chat to answer as many as we can today.
Sure. So a few questions from the chat that have scrolled through. So one question is, can ESSER be spent on pre-K, or is the intent of the funds to only be spent on K-12? ESSER can be spent on pre-kindergarten. That's one of the allowable uses. And I would say that one of the things that we'll be putting out soon is a detailed use of funds FAQ that addresses broadly a lot of the allowable uses of funds in ESSER. One thing that we've, of course, emphasized is the importance of early childhood education in being able to both address the impact of the pandemic as well as to address the educational inequities that existed prior to the pandemic. And so consideration of early childhood programming, including being able to sustain early childhood programming in the case of budget cuts, is something that is an important consideration, we hope, for states and for school districts. Second question, do we understand correctly that the American Rescue Plan ESSER state plan should address the entire SEA set aside and not just the remaining 1/3 of the funds that has not been awarded? Yes, that's exactly right. The American Rescue Plan ESSER state plan template is designed to get information and ask questions about the entire use of funds, the full $122 billion in the American Rescue Plan ESSER funds. So it's what's been awarded and the remaining portion of the allocation that has not. It provides an opportunity for states to describe their holistic approach to the considerations in how they are thinking about the uses of the funds and beginning to use the funds. Again, the stakeholder engagement that has gone into that and their plans moving forward in critical areas, including the 3 state levels. We have a question. What are the department's expectations for SEAs when an LEA does not meet a deadline or perhaps a required component of the Safe Return to School plan? One thing that we have emphasized is wanting to be as transparent as early as possible about what those requirements are. And of course, to be able to emphasize the role of technical assistance, whether it's with a state or an LEA that may have challenges with responding to any of the questions or better understanding what we're looking for in a specific question. And so that is the approach that we will continue to take. And if there are any cases where a state is having trouble with a deadline or needs additional information, we again urge them to contact the department directly. We have a question: when will the grant award notifications be made available to states? I think this is a reference to the assurances in the grant award notification, or GAN, that I mentioned earlier. Those have been made available to states. They were issued through the grant system on March 24th. They are also posted on the department's website under the American Rescue Plan ESSER Fund. I don't know if it's possible for us to put that link in the chat, but Britt or Jane, if it is possible, maybe we can put it in the chat. And if not, we can find another way to provide it to everybody who is on the call. We have a question. With pre-award costs available, where does the urgency arise from to allocate funds without a specific plan? I think that's a really important question, and I'm really glad it was asked. One thing that we find is that LEAs are frequently hesitant to begin spending the funds if they have not been allocated or awarded to the LEA. And that can come from uncertainty about when the funds will be awarded, whether they will be awarded by a state, particularly in a case where there's an appropriations or other process that has to occur first. And so having that certainty is critical in order to be able to ensure that school districts understand that they have the resources available to them to meet the urgent needs of students and of schools right now during the pandemic. And that's where our timelines and urgency are rooted. We have a question, will there be guidance regarding what meaningful consultation will look like? As I mentioned, and as was described in the presentation, we really focused on stakeholder engagement as being a core element of the state and LEA planning process for the use of American Rescue Plan funds. We include in the interim final requirements and in the American Rescue Plan ESSER state plan template a specific list of stakeholders with whom a state or an LEA must consult as applicable. And we believe that is important in order to ensure that consultation be broad and that it represents the diversity of the community within the state and the school district. We also recognize that meaningful engagement can take different forms. And we recognize and respect the work that states and school districts are already doing and have been doing throughout the pandemic and before the pandemic to engage their communities. And so we do not believe that one size fits all when it comes to stakeholder engagement. We do believe that stakeholder engagement is essential. And one of the things that we look forward to seeing and being able to amplify is best practices on how states and LEAs are engaging the diverse communities that they serve. We have a question here. When you refer to each underserved student group, are you referring to the subgroups as defined by ESSA? The statute specifically speaks to the groups of students defined in ESSA, as well as students experiencing homelessness and children and youth in foster care. And so in the slide, we've listed out the specific student groups in the ESSA reference in the American Rescue Plan, as well as the additional groups specified in the American Rescue Plan. And then we've also asked states to think about what other groups of students might be identified by the SEA as being an underserved group of students. And so, for example, that could include the students who have had the most lost instructional time as a result of school building closures during the pandemic. It could be students who have been least able to participate in remote instruction during periods when remote instruction was offered. It could be students in the criminal justice system. It could be LGBTQ students. It could be other groups of students that a state identifies. And so in addition to the required groups of students in the statute, we've asked states to give consideration to additional groups of students who've been underserved, who have been most impacted by the pandemic. And we have a question here, how do the 4 evidence-based practices levels in ESSA factor into this program? Are all 4 levels of evidence at play? The answer is yes. We refer it to evidence-based as incorporating the definition of evidence-based in ESSA as well. I see several questions in the chat focused on specific uses of funds. So again, we'll be issuing guidance on that shortly. We would also be happy to answer any specific use of funds questions through your state mailbox. And we'd be happy to provide answers to state specific questions in that way. I see a question in here about the American Rescue Plan funds for students experiencing homelessness. So I'll take a moment to talk about that. Last Friday, the department announced its plans for allocating and making it available to states. Funding from the $800 million pot included in the American Rescue Plan focused on children and youth experiencing homelessness, providing wraparound services, identification, and enabling students to fully participate in school and activities. We have made available as of the very beginning of this week the first $200 million of those funds for immediate use by states, and we'll be moving to make the remaining $600 million available as early as June, following a rulemaking so that we can explore making using a formula basis to replace the mandatory competitive subgrants from SEA to LEA that applies to McKinney-Vento funds. For the first $200 million, all of the standard McKinney-Vento provisions apply. Funds are administered by the state coordinator. Up to 25% can be used by the SEA for state uses. At least 75% must be allocated to LEAs using the competitive subgrant process. We have emphasized in the letter to chief state school officers that we issued last Friday the importance of using these funds quickly to identify students, to connect them with programming, and to provide support now in the spring as well as in the summer. And to the extent that it makes sense in the state context to use supplements to existing subgrantees to get money to LEAs as quickly as possible, while also looking more broadly to ensure that areas where there are concentrations of students experiencing homelessness are able to be served with that LEA level funding. We have also emphasized the flexible uses of funding under the program, and I'll reiterate it here because it's relevant to our discussion around the American Rescue Plan's ESSER fund, have also emphasized in that communication to state chiefs that the $800 million for students experiencing homelessness is additive to the American Rescue Plan's ESSER fund. That is, our expectation and the requirement is that states and LEAs serve students experiencing homelessness with their American Rescue Plan ESSER funds, just as they are required to serve other groups of students most impacted by the pandemic, and that the specific funds dedicated to students experiencing homelessness are intended to be additive to those services provided to all students under the ESSER fund, and not to take their place. Britt, let me stop there and turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Ian. I tried to, in the chat, I provided the link to the ARP ESSER site for the department, and at that link you can find the state template and the letter, all the materials that we provided regarding the ARP ESSER program. I also provided a link to the homeless program that's funded through the ARP, and just a reminder about how to communicate to us if you do not, or if you anticipate not being able to make the June 7th deadline. So please communicate by May 14th. And as Ian said, if you have state-specific questions, please continue to email your state email box.
I'm just looking, Britt,
to enable the screen reader space.
I want to read it because it's I think, critical to what we were talking about. Do ESSER 2 funds have to be spent before the American Rescue Plan ESSER funds? And the answer is no. American Rescue Plan funds can be spent effective as soon as they're received. Likewise, with the ESSER 2 funds that came through SRSA and the ESSER 1 funds through the CARES Act. All three of these funds should be available to states and to school districts and be able to be invested immediately to support the needs of students and schools.
Great. And as Ian said, I see a number of questions around uses of funds, and hopefully your questions will be addressed through our document. But in the meantime, you can also continue to email your state mailbox, and we will take those and try to answer them as quickly as possible. Somebody asked if the PowerPoint will be shared or posted online.
And the answer to that is yes. The presentation is being recorded and it will be posted on our webpage. I can't promise the turnaround time for that, but it will be posted as soon as we're able to get it posted.
Thanks, Jane.
The other information that we will be sharing as soon as we have the details is, as Marilyn mentioned, we are planning to do some regular technical assistance opportunities where we can answer questions that have come up. So please stay tuned for that. We anticipate being able to share information very soon about what those opportunities will be.
I want to address one question about the availability of funds. This has come up on a number of occasions, and we tried to address this through our fact sheet. But again, I just want to address it directly. The ARP ESSER funds Congress made available through September 30th of 2023, and the Tidings Amendment provides a waiver and allows states an additional year to spend down those funds. As many of you know, and if you're familiar with grants through the federal grants, there's then after that period, the performance period, there's a liquidation period, and that period of time is 4 months. So that means that you would have an additional 4 months to pay your bills, essentially. And then if you're interested in learning about the rules and all the requirements for a late liquidation, that information is posted on the department's website. But we would not say that funds are available for, I think someone said, until 2029. With that, Jane?
Great, thank you, Brent. And I want to thank Ian and Meredith, as well as our hosts. We appreciate all the time that folks have taken to join us for this conversation. And we look forward to continuing to work with you through the application period and into the continued recovery and the support that you're providing to students and families. Thank you very much, and we look forward to continuing our work together. Bye-bye.
I do too. I look forward
That
to.
concludes our conference. Thank you for using event services. You may now disconnect.
Thank you. The presentation ended. I can end, stop. First I gotta stop the recording. You guys tune in, learn something. Everything is online.